On April 25, 1898, Americans woke to news that the nation was at war. The people of Cuba were fighting an ongoing battle to free their country from Spanish control. And for the past 2 years, the leading newspapers in the United States had been trying to snare readers with sensational coverage of the conflict. Reports of Spanish atrocities, some of them entirely fictitious, had dominated the headlines for months, persuading many Americans that the United States had a duty to intervene. Now, Congress had authorized the use of force to guarantee Cuba's independence from Spain. The Spanish-American War had begun.
The war itself was seen as a just war, the liberation of Cuba from the dominance of Spain. Spain was seen as a faraway foreign power that had no right to be within the sphere of American influence. And if the war was presented in the right way to the public, then there would be genuine public support, which there was.
Hoping to boost their circulations even further, American newspapers recruited some of the country's best-known writers to cover the conflict. The New York World signed on Stephen Crane, author of the wildly popular novel Red Badge of Courage. But it was the New York Herald that managed to score the most celebrated of them all, a 34-year-old short story writer named Richard Harding Davis. Davis had been only 14 when he announced his intention to become more famous than Mark Twain. After turning out a series of stories that featured witty, well-dressed characters loosely based on himself, Davis had turned his hand to news, volunteering to cover the Greco-Turkish War in 1897. His dispatches were colorful and romantic. One compared the sound of bullets to the rustle of silk. Another likened the conflict to a duel between gentlemen. American readers couldn't get enough of them.
Richard Harding Davis didn't see wars as something wrong. It was a game, it was a big adventure. People read Richard Harding Davis not just because of what he wrote, because it was Richard Harding Davis writing.
This was a period when reporting was becoming, really, I think for the first time in its history, a dashing profession, a glamorous profession, a romantic profession, and nobody exemplified that more than Richard Harding Davis.
American reporters had been sending news from the front lines since the Civil War, when the telegraph had made it possible to watch a battle in the morning and have an account in the papers by the following afternoon. To curb the press's tendency to exaggerate and criticize, some military commanders had begun requiring journalists to sign their names to their stories. By now, the byline was commonplace, and reporters like Richard Harding Davis were stars. For Cuba, Davis made certain he looked the part, outfitting himself with an elaborate war costume that included top boots, a canvas shooting jacket, and a revolver. He was so confident that his fame would put him in the thick of the fighting that he even made out a will. But when the American fleet anchored off the Cuban coast, the commanding general ordered him to remain on board the press boat with the other correspondents until all of the soldiers were safely ashore.
Richard Harding Davis ran into the same trouble as war correspondents today run into everywhere. A lot of the military didn't want him along. Davis found himself banned from accompanying the forces and unable to write anything. So he looked around for a commander who would give him permission to go along with him.
Davis zeroed in on the lieutenant colonel of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, a charismatic civil servant named Theodore Roosevelt. A good reporter, Davis argued, could put Roosevelt on the pages of history. It was an offer the ambitious lieutenant colonel couldn't refuse. A few weeks later, Davis watched breathlessly as Roosevelt rushed a key enemy position on Kettle Hill. Roosevelt, mounted high on horseback, charging the rifle pits at a gallop, made you feel that you would like to cheer, Davis told his readers. No one who saw Roosevelt take that ride expected he would finish it alive. It looked like foolhardiness, but he set the pace with his horse that inspired his men to follow.
All wars need a hero. In the Spanish-American War, Richard Harding Davis, who had far more influence than any other correspondents there, chose Teddy Roosevelt and wrote a stirring story of thundering hooves and rifle shots with Roosevelt at the head charging along on his horse. And this was exactly the sort of stuff that the readers of the American press wanted to read.
By the time Davis returned home, slightly ahead of the victorious American forces, Roosevelt was a national figure, and Davis himself had earned a reputation as the country's premier war correspondent. He would spend the next decade and a half traipsing around the globe, covering conflicts in South Africa, Mexico, and Japan, captivating Americans with his tales of bravery and honor.